Every one of us has blind spots, things that we do, that we think, that we believe, that we don't even realize about ourselves. And one of the things I loved about my time in America was that I got the opportunity to see things from a different perspective and spot some of those blind spots, those things, those assumptions that were going on in my life that I had no idea were driving me, were shaping me. Each of us has those blind spots, and it's a great thing when we get the opportunity to see them, because we're able to appreciate them and sometimes even to do something about them. Blind spots can sometimes be quite dangerous and are things that we need to address. And that's particularly true when we come to Mark chapter 8 this evening, as we think about blind spots that prevent our faith in Jesus. The passage is very similar to a passage back in Mark chapter 6 where Jesus feeds the 5,000, and here in Mark 8 he feeds 4,000 people in the desert. There's many similarities between those two, and we saw in this passage three, indicators that there are spiritual blind spots in the people that Jesus interacts with that help us see some of our blind spots today. And the first one of those indicators we saw is anxiety. There in verse 4, the disciples ask Jesus, where are we going to get food for all these people? Now, of course, that's a blind spot. They should have understood from the feeding of the 5,000 that Jesus is more than able to provide for people in the desert, hungry people who need food. And yet they weren't able to see it. They saw the level of challenge, this seemingly impossible task in front of them, and they had real anxiety about that. And one of the things that we thought about on Sunday was that our anxieties often reveal to us that we are struggling to trust Jesus. That whatever challenge is facing us, however big or small, we're finding that difficult. But we know, don't we, that Jesus is more than able. We see in the first 10 verses of Mark 8 that he is filled with compassion. He is patient with those of us, all of us, who struggle to trust him and to act in a way that lines up with what we know to be true in the Bible. And he also is able to provide. And so if we know those things about Jesus, whatever challenges we're facing, we shouldn't be filled with anxiety, and yet often we are. We have faith blind spots that prevent us from trusting him. So that's the first indicator that there's a faith blind spot going on in our lives. The second one that we see is in the response of the Pharisees. They are hostile to Jesus. They harangue him. They test him. They ask him for a sign. Essentially, they're trying to disprove who he's claiming to be and show him up to be wrong. And again, I think sometimes we see that sort of hostility in our own lives. There are things that God says to us in his word that we simply do not want to accept or believe. And we work hard to dismiss those things, to push God away. And the warning, I think, there in Mark 8 is that when the Pharisees approached Jesus like this, he wasn't interested. He sighs, he's clearly frustrated by how they are coming to him, and he refuses to engage with what they're doing and actually leaves. He rejects them. And the warning that he gives to his disciples in verse 15 is beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. What he's saying there is that holding hostility in our hearts, in our lives, even over a small number of things, maybe on one or two issues, it's a bit like yeast that spreads through the whole dough. And eventually, if we allow hostility to continue in our lives, it will grow and affect all of our lives. Very sadly, I've seen several instances in the past where someone was unwilling to let Jesus rule and reign in one area of their lives. They were unwilling to submit to him in that. They pushed him away, and eventually their entire profession of faith crumbled. So we need to deal with hostility. We need to deal with anxiety. These are blind spots or indicators that we have faith blind spots in our lives. And the third thing that we see in Mark 8 is preoccupation can be a real indicator of a faith blind spot. It's kind of amusing, isn't it? The disciples and Jesus get back in the boat, they're sailing away, and the disciples, all they can think about is the fact that somehow or other, although there was 7 basketfuls worth of bread knocking about just a few verses before, they've only managed to come with 1 loaf of bread into the boat. And they're grumbling, they're complaining, they're maybe pointing fingers at one another. Who's left all the bread on the shore? Now we're going to be hungry for today. And when Jesus says to them this pretty significant warning about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, they go, he's talking about bread, isn't he? Because all they can think about, they're preoccupied with the idea of bread. And that definitely happens in our lives too. We've got different things going on, maybe different sin struggles, different challenges, different relationships that we're trying to work through. And when God is speaking to us, all we can think about is those things. And we're not listening carefully to what Jesus is saying. And so our preoccupations prevent us from hearing what he says and responding to him in faith. And so we're going to talk tonight about our faith blind spots, about things that make us anxious, about things sometimes that make us hostile, about things maybe that we're preoccupied by. And then we're going to ask, what do we need to see about Jesus that will help us to trust him with these things? How can we eradicate those faith blind spots so that we can live in relationship with God, experiencing his blessing, experiencing his grace? And then we're going to close our time by praying, because it's no coincidence that Jesus follows up this passage in Mark 8 with what happens in verses 22 to 26, where he comes and heals a blind man. He essentially says to his disciples towards the end there in verses 17 to 21, you're blind, you're deaf, there's something spiritually wrong with you inside that is preventing you from seeing. You have these faith blind spots. And then immediately he heals a blind man. There's no coincidence there. Jesus is showing us that he is the one who can open blind eyes. He could do it physically for that man back in the 1st century in Israel. And he can do it for each of us today. So I hope you have a great time studying Mark this evening and rooting out those faith blind spots in your lives.